Hey everyone, welcome to the conclusion of our lecture topic from this past Friday. This replaces the first part of our lecture for Monday for Animal Phys, just to make sure that we keep on top of the material in spite of having a snow day. So it's not as much fun as being in person, but hopefully this helps us keep up with what we need to accomplish. So just as a reminder from Friday, we are starting to get introduced to oxygen and carbon dioxide physiology and thinking about gas and water interactions. And our major questions to address in this section are to think about which way and how gases will move, how fast gas will go, what animals need to do when diffusion doesn't work, and we're going to wrap up by exploring why life is so hard underwater. I'm going to try to move pretty quickly through the first part of this because it will repeat some of the information from lecture on Friday, but I figured that doesn't hurt, and then we'll start diving into some new topics from there. So again, for thinking about oxygen and carbon dioxide transport, we start out by investigating some principles that are based in the physics and chemistry of the situation. Then we're going to talk about the generalized strategies that animals use, and then we'll start exploring some trends and exceptions in how animals accomplish these things. So again, there's two major movement mechanisms that animals will use, simple diffusion and bulk flow. And we're going to come back to these after we look at the simple diffusion of gases in gas and aqueous environments. So for thinking about simple diffusion of gases, we have to consider two factors. We need to consider partial pressure and we need to consider concentration. And as we're doing this, it's really important to realize that chemicals do not diffuse simply on the basis of concentration gradients. There are other chemical properties that matter that are specific to each molecule. So for this class, for physiology, we need to think simple diffusion does not refer to movement down a concentration gradient. Instead, it will refer to movement based on other factors. So if we're thinking about gases in air and how they behave, thankfully, that's actually an exception to what I just told you. Gases tend to behave in roughly the same fashion when we're only talking about air. Right? So if we're trying to understand the relationship between a gas's pressure and its concentration in air, it's pretty straightforward to do that. And that's actually where the ideal gas law comes in handy. It mathematically relates pressure and concentration. But again, the air that we and other terrestrial animals breathe is not composed of a single gas, so we need to think about multiple gases simultaneously. And thankfully, to be able to do that, we can use Dalton's law of partial pressures. And Dalton's law simply states that the total pressure is equal to the sum of the partial pressures of the individual gases that are found in that location. Right, so if we wanted to calculate oxygen's partial pressure in air, we could use the ideal gas law to do that, right? Figure out, okay, for a mole of oxygen in a liter at standard temperature and pressure, remembering Boltzmann's constant, we could do a bunch of math, but we're not really a physics or chemistry course, we're physiology, so let's just focus on a summary point. So one of the more important summary points is that you can figure out a gas partial pressure by, if you know the entire pressure in an area and the fraction of the air that is composed of that gas, you can just multiply the total pressure times the fraction or fractional concentration to get the partial pressure of that gas. Right? So we did that to figure out the partial pressure of oxygen at sea level. Right, in 1 atmosphere, it's going to be 0.2095 multiplied by 1 atmosphere, or 0.2095 atmospheres. Here's a slightly different way of looking at that. If we took a container of known volume that contained just 1 mole of nitrogen and measured the pressure of that container at 50 millimeters of mercury, and we took a second container of 1 mole of oxygen and measured that container's pressure at 50 millimoles of mercury, if we combined both of those, the overall pressure in the container would be 100 millimoles of mercury of that gas mixture. All right, so again, we can determine oxygen's concentration in air just by rearranging the ideal gas law. And the main thing I want to emphasize here is that at a given temperature in air, partial pressure is going to be directly proportional to that gas's concentration. So that's pretty straightforward. So now we should turn our attention from air to aqueous solutions. And again, we wrapped up on Friday talking about how in water, when equilibrium has been reached between air and water, we can define the partial pressure of a gas in water as equal to the partial pressure of that gas in the gas phase above water. So here's two example containers that are being maintained at different pressures. Whatever the partial pressure is of the gas in the gas phase in container number 1, we define the same partial pressure in water, and same thing for container number 2. Whatever the partial pressure of air is here, same partial pressure within water. And this simply reflects the point that any gas molecule under equilibrium conditions has an equal probability of going into or out of solution. All right, so now if we're thinking about what's happening, right? So if our partial pressure of oxygen in air is 0.2095 atmospheres, and we want to figure out the partial pressure of oxygen in water, we'd expect it to also be 0.21 atmospheres. So now let's talk about concentrations of gases in aqueous solutions. This is a place where another formula becomes convenient, Henry's law. So Henry's law is, as written here, C of I is equal to A times P of I. So in this case, we have this A coefficient for partial pressure. And the A coefficient in this instance is what's known as an absorption coefficient, right? So it tells us something about the solubility of a gas in solution. So if we know the partial pressure of oxygen in air is 0.21 atmospheres, and I've also added to this some information about the concentration of oxygen in air, 8.6 millimoles per liter. And if we know that the solubility of oxygen at 20 degrees is 1.4 millimoles per liter per atmosphere, that should let us calculate the concentration of oxygen in solution. So we should go ahead and do that, and we should also take a moment to think about which way, if any, would you expect chemical diffusion of oxygen to go. Okay, so I just opened up a little notepad over here to record the information from this question. So if our partial pressure of oxygen is approximately 0.21 atmospheres, our solubility or absorption coefficient is 1.4 millimoles per liter per atmosphere, right? If we just multiply these two numbers together, so 0.21 times 1.4, we're going to get concentration, and notice that our atmosphere units are going to drop out. We're going to get a concentration of 0.294. All right, so then the $1,000 question here is, now which way will chemical diffusion of oxygen go? So look at these numbers and note, again, oxygen does not move simply on the basis of a concentration gradient. Instead, gases, when we're thinking about gases in the gas phase, gases move in the direction of their partial pressure gradient. Let's actually type that over here on the notepad as a reminder. So gases move in the direction of their partial pressure gradient, right? So if the partial pressure of oxygen in air is 0.21 and the partial pressure of oxygen in water is 0.21, there will be no net movement of oxygen either in or out of this solution. Okay. So again, the behavior of different gases in water depends on the identity of the gas. It also depends on two other conditions of that aqueous solution. It depends on the temperature of the solution and on that solution's salinity or salt concentration. So to help us think about this, this is a table derived from information in our textbook. Let's first look at the solubility coefficients for oxygen across a series of different conditions. So if we think about oxygen in distilled water at 0 degrees Celsius, the absorption coefficient there is 2.2. If we heat up that water to 20 degrees Celsius, notice that our absorption coefficient has declined, so it's now 1.4. And if we jump all the way up to 40 degrees Celsius, now the absorption coefficient or solubility of oxygen in water is less than half of what it was at 0 degrees Celsius. And if you pause and think about this for a moment, you might actually be able to identify some scenarios in everyday life where you can observe some of the consequences of this. So let's say, and now this is not with oxygen, this has to do with carbon dioxide, but let's say that it's a warm day and you're looking for a refreshing beverage. So you go to the fridge, you pull out a soda, you crack it open, and you let it sit there. You will notice gas bubbles forming in the soda. Right, those are gases coming out of the aqueous state into the gas phase. Right, so as that soda starts to warm up at room temperature, more and more of that gas will come out of the liquid phase and enter into the gas phase, because as temperature increases, that gas's solubility decreases. So that's a constant pattern across different gas types. So now let's compare what happens in a liquid that has some salt in it in addition to just water. So these next two columns are 80% seawater at 0 degrees Celsius and 100% seawater at 0 degrees Celsius. So notice both of these are lower overall compared to our solubility in distilled water, right? So as salinity increases, solubility also decreases. And now let's extend this to look at the solubilities of other substances. So if we jump down now to carbon dioxide at 0 degrees, notice that the solubility of carbon dioxide at 0 degrees is 77, right? And now if you compare this, look at the ratio of the solubility of oxygen compared to the solubility of carbon dioxide, 77 divided by 2.2. What you'll find is that at any particular partial pressure and temperature, the concentration of oxygen in solution could be 35 times greater than the concentration of oxygen would be, right? That is massive, right? So carbon dioxide is more than tenfold. It's 35 times more soluble in solution relative to oxygen, right? And that's going to wind up being important. Also notice nitrogen is actually not quite as soluble as oxygen is, again, under those initial conditions. Okay, so now we're ready to go back to the puzzle of how diving beetles manage to stay underwater for hours and hours at a time, even though they're air breathers. So they're not holding their breath to accomplish this. They're using some tricks. Right, so if we just keep in mind that the major driver for moving gases is partial pressure gradients, and that gases will undergo simple diffusion down their partial pressure gradients, let's now study what happens with these diving beetles to understand what's taking place in them. So we've got atmospheric conditions here in the air above the water where diving beetles are found. And then we've got conditions in the water as well. And in general, if the water is fairly fast-moving water in contact with air, and we'll come back to those points in a little bit, it too will have an oxygen partial pressure that's similar to the oxygen partial pressure found in the air of 0.21 atmospheres. And again, the concentration is a lot lower, right, because it has a low solubility coefficient. But that indicates there's not going to be any net movement of oxygen between air and water. One thing I didn't tell you about these diving beetles is that when they dive, they actually take a bubble of air with them. You can't really see it in the video I showed you because it's tucked under the beetle's belly, but they all have it if you were to check for one. This bubble, interestingly enough, has a different gas composition compared to the water around it. So it has a lower partial pressure of oxygen, and it has, because it's a gas, it has a higher concentration of oxygen. But notice that the partial pressure of the air inside of this bubble is lower than the partial pressure of air in water, right? So that's going to favor net movement of oxygen from the surrounding water into the bubble. Okay. Now, in the meantime, the beetle's actually using oxygen from this bubble, right? So as it uses up oxygen from the bubble, it's going to continue lowering the partial pressure in the bubble, right? So we could also draw a second arrow here just to symbolize oxygen getting used up by the beetle as it's respiring. So if the beetle is continuing to use up oxygen out of this bubble, it's going to lower the oxygen partial pressure in the bubble, and it's going to maintain that partial pressure gradient, continuing to favor the movement of oxygen out of the water back into the bubble. Right, and so this is really the secret for how diving beetles can stay underwater for so long. This bubble actually acts as a sort of artificial gill, and it does so just by increasing the surface area between air and water. And that's important for aiding diffusion, and we'll talk more about that soon. All right, so there's some looking ahead stuff. Again, be prepared for lab on Tuesday. We'll see what happens with the snow. And for right now, and here's a preview again of some of the types of calculations expected for the dimensional analysis assignment. I do want you to show your work thoroughly on the assignment, follow the dimensional analysis process. We'll pick up from there for lab. But that's it for this first video.